Welcome to our show, Lighten Up Your World, where we discuss the teachings of the Ascended Masters and how they can help us in our daily lives. The Ascended Masters are saints from East and West who have walked the path of the Ascension and attained union with God. Today we're going to talk about the life of Sir Francis Bacon, who is now the Ascended Master Saint Germain, whose picture you see over my shoulder. Sir Francis Bacon, as the history books tell us, was a very brilliant philosopher and scientist who laid the foundation for the modern age. However, much of his life is not universally recognized, and there's recently been published a book called The Shakespeare Code by Virginia Fellows, and this outlines the secret hidden life of Sir Francis Bacon. Apparently, according to this book, there were codes embedded in the Shakespeare plays and other writings, and these codes, when deciphered, revealed the inner life, the true life of Sir Francis Bacon. Today we have with us Lawrence Robin, who has spent many years studying the life of Sir Francis Bacon, and he's going to talk to us about these codes and what it shows about the life of Sir Francis Bacon. Welcome, Lawrence.
Hey, Ruth.
So, it seems quite amazing to me that the Shakespeare plays, which we know as very sublime poetry and with magnificent insights into human nature, that within it there are more stories, and these stories are in codes actually embedded within the plays. Now, how were these codes discovered?
I was thinking about it this morning about anybody who likes mysteries. This is a path to investigate because if you just read the Shakespeare plays alone, the stories are fascinating about life and death and good and evil and all the tests we go through. But in addition to that, there is another whole story about Francis Bacon's time, his life, his views, the Queen, the inner workings of all the politics at the time, that he felt very afraid to publish because he would have been put to death at the time. So he put them in the plays and wrote the outer story around them. So he had something he wanted to share, but it couldn't be published during his lifetime. So he did it in an inner secret way. And there's a number of different codes that he wrote them in, which we can talk about.
So it's really several hundred years since Shakespeare plays were written, and it's taken all this time for the codes to be found. So when were the codes actually first found? Was it just this century or previous centuries?
I don't know if they have an exact date, because a lot of people were suspicious that a country bumpkin who didn't really have much education could have written the plays, and in their suspicion they started doing more investigating. So around the Civil War times, a lady named Delia Bacon did a lot of research. She investigated what she called the Promise book, which was a lot of the writings that Francis Bacon had written down, famous sayings, famous things out of other plays, and he incorporated that into the writings of Shakespeare. So she might have been one of the first famous people that started investigating it, but mostly toward the end of the 1800s, two different people, a doctor in Michigan named Dr. Owen, started memorizing the plays. He used to travel the country roads and recite them, and he started finding coincidences of why would he be talking about ships in the middle of a scene with the Queen in the courts, and things didn't quite seem to mesh. So because of that curiosity, he started seeing that there was a lot of different things that, if they were rearranged, seemed to fit together, not in the way they were written in the plays. And being a brilliant man, he actually discovered one of the codes, which they called the word code that Francis Bacon used, and he got the ball going. Mrs. Gallup, also about the same time, discovered another one of the codes called the biliteral code, and the two of them together kind of opened the book over 100 years ago, and people have been investigating it ever since.
So Sir Francis Bacon then must have written passages with the codes in them, and then from that built the plays around the codes.
That's correct. Depending a little bit on what the code was, because one of them in particular, which I have not researched enough, but I know in The Tempest, one of the first major letters in it, I think it opens up the passage, has his name, Francis Bacon, inscribed in the letter, and you couldn't see it unless you had a microscope. So that's what he calls his capital letter code, and I have not researched it any more than that, but to me it's like amazing. It took over 200 or 300 years to even find it.
That's really fascinating, very amazing. So what does the codes, just let's start at the beginning with Sir Francis Bacon's life. What do the codes tell us about his birth?
Well, it's very dubious because they say he was born in either York Place or York House, which is two different buildings. And that's actually a clue that he was born of Queen Elizabeth and moved to the next door building and shipped off to the Bacons. Now, he did not know that, and history doesn't teach us that, but it's in the codes. So when he was born, it was pretty point blank. He was born in this date in 1561. He died at this time, and he was a statesman and was a researcher and scientist, but none of his really truly inner life and turmoil and tests that he went through, and that's what he explains in the codes.
So you're saying York Place and York House, and was one there, then the family of Nicholas Bacon was in one house, and then, can you just explain why that's so key, York House and York Place?
Well, they wrote it as two birthplaces, sort of like when we talk about his death, where they say he died in a number of different places, so it's very ambiguous. But bottom line is, the Queen could not expose that she was having a child. A lot of Protestant versus Catholic factions going on. She was in line to be queen, which would have really caused a lot of turmoil, having a pregnant queen, especially if she's claiming to be the virgin queen. So he was secretly snuck out and put in the Bacon's home, who adopted him under oath that they would not expose that the Queen was the mother. Now, when he was 15 years old, there's an instance we can talk about in the courts where she loses her temper. She exposes to him that she is his mother, has a little temper tantrum more or less, and he runs home to Anne Bacon and says, "Is this true?" So it was a very traumatic time for him, and he found out through an explosion at the court, instigated by somebody who did not like him.
So once he knows that he is actually of royal descent, and in fact in line for the throne, so what happens next? Does the Queen then acknowledge him, or what happens?
She pretty much panics. The people in the immediate circle obviously knew about it because they were there in the court at the time. And she was a very good dissimulator, which means she always liked to try to put things off and not face them head on. So her immediate reaction was, I'm going to go send him to France for a while to go study in the courts of France. And this became a very wonderful turning point for him for a number of reasons, such as he went with a fellow who is an expert in codes and code breaking. He met with people in France who wrote codes and studied codes. And also he met the love of his life, which we'll talk about, that he wrote about in Romeo and Juliet.
So just to backpedal a little bit, so we have the Queen Elizabeth as the mother, and of course she wasn't married, or was she?
Well, she was, but not according to history.
Oh.
Lord Leicester was her husband, and according to the traditional way of looking at things, they think he was just her lover, and that she kind of kept him in the background, and she would not promote him and acknowledge him. For one thing, she didn't want him to be the king. She wanted to be the queen, and also just opening up that whole ball of wax of having a child. And then a second child later, Francis Bacon's brother, Robert. And with all the religious turmoil, politics turmoil, with her on shaky ground, with her being raised, basically being put in prison and then being released from prison to become the queen, it was not a risk she was willing to take.
So I can see that Francis Bacon really had a lot to contend with, because suddenly, age of 15 did you say? He suddenly learns that he is the heir to the throne, and he's suddenly shipped off to France, and then he's wondering what to do with his life, because he's not really acknowledged by anybody, although perhaps some people knew that he was the son of Elizabeth I.
What's interesting is when he went to France, the king acknowledges and knows who he is. Some of the court does. Obviously, he wouldn't just go over to France and be acknowledged and accepted by the king unless there was some communication before that. He actually compliments him that reminds him of his father and mother. So the inner circle knew, the public did not, and it obviously wouldn't be published at the time because a number of people lost their heads or ears or hands or whatever for speaking things that they shouldn't. So yes, at 15, he was a very mature young man. He'd already been to college and basically learned all that he thought they could teach him. And he went over there to learn the etiquette, the customs, the mores of the culture of France, but also he traveled throughout Europe.
And so when he was in France, you mentioned that something about the love of his life. So what did that involve?
Well, the princess at the time, Margaret, was married, wishing to have a divorce, did not love her husband, and Francis immediately fell in love with her. And it was one of those love at first sight things. And he wrote a lot of sonnets that involve her. If you read them now with the perspective of the dark-eyed lady who she was, you can understand them better. And I won't say he fell head over heels, but it was a true love of his life that I don't think he ever got over. He did marry late in life, but this was his true love. Again, because of politics, because the queen nixed it, because he was younger and the queen was married, you know, it just became too messy. So they would not allow it and they put an end to it. So they did not die as in Romeo and Juliet, but it was smashed.
So it's a definite Romeo and Juliet romance, though, because of the ages, because he must have been, I don't know, late teens at that point. So.
Well, he was actually, you know, right after he went there, he was still 15, 16 years old. I don't recall how much older she was, but as you know, true love knows no age.
Right.
And, you know, I think because also her learning, her witty mind, she was well-groomed, and he was raised in the courts. That's what he knew, which I've never quite understood why the historians don't address. Why was this guy who really wasn't royalty spending all this time in the court and a favorite of the queen, and she called him my little keeper, and all this connection that they just seemed to say, I guess he was just a favorite. So that explains a lot why he would fall in love with somebody who was of royalty.
And it also brings back to one of your points about William Shakespeare, the actor, who came from this backwater town and really didn't mingle with royalty. But a lot of Shakespearean plays are actually have a lot of royal scenes in them and about the kings. So that kind of explains the authorship a little bit.
It'd be like me trying to write about brain surgery. I don't have a clue. And the Shakespeare who was the son of a butcher and who had actually some rub-ins with the law and was uneducated and was not raised around royalty, was not a lawyer, and a lot of the things in the Shakespeare plays are written in lawyer's language, which Francis Bacon was. They just don't make sense. And I know that the Orthodox traditional way is not accepting a lot of these views. And I just scratch my head and go, what's the disconnect here? I mean, why aren't they seeing this? How could somebody of my education write about traveling throughout Europe, kings and queens and different political systems around Europe? That was not done by somebody raised in Stratford who stayed there.
So you mentioned that he was a lawyer. So when he came back from France, did he pursue a legal profession at that point?
I don't know if the correct word is pursue, only that he came back because he had a vision that his foster father died. He had a vision of the house painted black, so he put it together and came back about a month after Mr. Bacon died. But when he came back, he was pretty much forced into becoming a lawyer by his mother. She wanted him to earn his keep. She kept him under her boot. She kept the purse strings really tight, and he had to learn some way to make his way. It was not his true love, and he said that from the beginning. He would rather be studying everything else in the world but law, which he found very dry. But that was his training, and you can see it in the plays because there's a lot of legal language that was part of his vocabulary.
And then what was the turning point for him in his life when he decided to write the Shakespeare plays and put the codes in there? What kind of led up to that?
He actually had a visitation by a being because he was very discouraged, heartbroken, had gone through the trauma of being sent away from his true love, came back, and obviously his life was in a big question mark because the queen didn't want to acknowledge him still. He didn't have any inheritance from the Bacons. He was basically broke, but he was royalty. So he had this educational training, but he did not have any way really to make a living. So he was put in Gray's Inn to learn to become a lawyer. He learned it as people today who would rather be doing a million different things with their life, but are doing their day-to-day job, and they have a love elsewhere. And Francis Bacon wanted to make all knowledge his universe, and he wanted to study the science, the literature, all of the past writings in Latin and Greek. That's part of his soul. But he had to go to school, and that's what he did.
Well, I know that the Shakespearean plays actually transformed the English language, and so that was almost like a mission, do you think, for him to do that?
Absolutely. He wanted to raise up society. The language at that time was basically Latin, of the people who had education, which was very few. There was a lot of dialects of English. A lot of people couldn't understand each other, sort of like New Yorkers versus Southerners versus people with Appalachian accents. So he wanted to unify it, but also expand it so that they can express themselves more freely in their own language and not use the Latin language. And you'll see a lot of words that he developed were from the Greek and the Latin and the French, etc., Spanish. And he made them into English words and made them more popular. So he greatly expanded it. And I think it's like 20,000 word vocabulary he had compared to the average person who had a few thousand. So he really stepped up and rose the consciousness of the people.
And so by transforming the English language, it became a language which could express very high ideals and philosophy, which of course he wanted to do with his advancement of learning and other philosophical tracks.
Sort of like the parables, I'd say. He wanted to use stories to reach the people, to teach them moral and ethical lessons. And you can see it throughout the plays. And there's such great wisdom in there. Regardless if there's codes or not, it's a lifetime study. And then when you find out about an inner story and the codes within it, it's like, gee, I wish I had a few